Hello, real estate fans. So, I've got a topic today that I wish I would have been able to share with my 19-year-old self. And even more today, when we're in this environment where in big urban centers, housing costs are just spiraling out of control. And that's a challenge for so many people, be it in terms of their personal finances, because rents are becoming so expensive. And then for those of us who are interested in going on a real estate journey, the cost of getting onto the first rung of the property ladder is just making things so difficult. And I see this a lot with my tenants. So when we have people who come and apply for apartments, basically the way in which we as landlords assess the financial health of the people who apply for units is in looking at how much of their monthly income is the rent going to eat up. And as a general rule of thumb, a portrait of financial health is somewhere between 30 to 50% of that person's income. And so let's just pause to think about that for a second. So your typical tenant, your typical person who is tied to a job or who is renting or who is looking at buying that single family home, most typically that person is working as an employee. So depending on where you live, I live in Canada, and in Canada we about half of our income goes to taxes. So basically at your job you're working for, let's say you work to earn a dollar. Of that dollar, you only get to keep 50 cents. And then of that 50 cents that you have at the end of the day, 30 to 50% of it has to go to your housing costs. That's just insane. Whatever your goals are, if it's that you're trying to build a better lifestyle for yourself and your family, or if it's that you're trying to save down payment money in order to acquire that first property or the second property, or to grow, what you do with your housing expense is just going to have such a big effect on your ability to make other moves later on. So I want to talk about a solution to getting on that bottom rung of the housing ladder, and that is house hacking. And so, if it's not clear to you exactly what the benefit is of reducing that monthly housing expense for yourself, it's saving down payment money. It also has to do with how the banks are going to look at you if you're planning on using your personal debt ratios. So, one of the things that the banks will add to that personal debt ratio calculation is, what is your housing expense? Now, if you're renting a room or if you are staying with someone and so you basically have no housing costs, that's going to be a very big difference than if you're paying, for example, $2,000 or $3,000 in monthly rent. Because when the bank is assessing your debt ratios and your file, they're basically going to be looking at, what are your overhead expenses? What does it take for you to run your own life and to not get yourself into financial trouble? And because your housing expense is just such a huge portion of what you do with your after-tax income, if you're showing this big expense, be it from a single family home that you pay for that mortgage, or if it's an expensive unit that you rent on your own, in many cases, showing those financial obligations on your portfolio to the bank, like on your file to the bank, is going to be a make it or break it when it comes to adding a second property. Then there's also considering what market you're going to invest in. Because one of the challenges, like I live in Montreal, basically in Canada, most of our population lives in three huge centers, be it Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. And in those areas, it's becoming increasingly difficult. Montreal is still kind of like a bit lower priced, but in Toronto and Vancouver, it's becoming extremely difficult for people to afford housing when they're looking at purchasing it, or even if it comes to renting. And so one of the ways, if you live in those areas, to start investing is to consider investing outside of your home market. But then that presents a specific challenge. And that challenge is, let's say you work in Vancouver or Toronto, or like even in a lesser effect in Montreal, and you want to invest in a submarket where it's going to be easier to find properties that cash flow, and maybe the barrier to entry is a lower price tag on the whatever it is that you're looking at acquiring. You still have to live somewhere. And so looking at how you can cut that housing cost in order to save down payment money, or else to lower those debt ratios so that the bank is going to be more interested in financing you, like that becomes one of those nuts that you kind of have to crack in order to continue to grow as an investor. And this is why I want to flip the conversation and talk a little bit about house hacking. So, now this is not a topic that I talk about all that often because I'm further along in my investment journey and I now own a single family home. So this is no longer part of my day to day. But I want to kind of back up to when I started on this journey, and I was a 19-year-old student, and I left my parents' house. And then what decisions did I make with my housing that then opened onto this career as a real estate investor. And I want to take some time to lay that out for you guys because you're going to see just how impactful that is. So, when I was a student, I moved out of my parents' place and it just so happened that the student residences were full at that time. But just that you are aware what the difference in the overhead price would have been in those cases. So I actually ended up renting a room in a huge Victorian mansion. I was actually a co-op house at that time in Toronto when I attended University of Toronto. But at the time, the cost of a room like that, I think it was something like $400, everything included, heating, various other things. And that would have been almost half the cost of what it would have cost at that point. My parents were paying my rent, but that would have been half of the price tag that it would have cost for me to go into student residence. So whatever your situation is, when you're in that initial phase, you're 18, 19, 20 years old and you're thinking about setting yourself up for the first time, moving out of your parents' house and becoming financially independent, you really want to take the time to consider how are you going to set that up for yourself so that it's less of a financial burden. And for me, the answer at that point was to rent a room as opposed to renting an apartment. And the savings of this, so one is just the base rent. So if you think about, the actual rent at that time was about $400. Today, that's probably not a realistic figure. But if I had rented an apartment for myself at that time, it probably would have cost me $800. But then $800 is not the end of the story because then I have to pay for internet. I have to pay for heating. I have to pay for home insurance. I have to pay for all of those additional costs that go along with maintaining a house. And if I'm maintaining that place just only for myself, it's going to create an additional financial burden more over and above just what the rent is. Because instead of splitting those costs or potentially renting like an all-included room, it's going to mean that I'm going to be the one who's carrying that on my back. And so for those of you who are at the very beginning of your journey and who are thinking about how am I going to set myself up to win in this field, to like cut my overhead so that I'm able to allocate those financial resources to something that's going to help me advance, I would really encourage you to consider renting a room. That's kind of like the very first thing. If you're asking yourself the question, should I go out and rent an apartment when I leave my parents' house or should I rent a room? I would encourage you to think about renting a room. And there are other things that go into this. And, for a lot of us, maybe we have this dream of independence or we're a bit concerned about what it's going to be like to live with roommates. I'm going to circle back to that at the end of this episode because I think that's a concern. It's a very valid concern. And I'm going to get into exactly how you set up those house hacks in a way that it's not going to ruin your lifestyle. So we'll just put a pin in that and come back to it. The next step in the house hacking journey is once you're beyond that place where you're considering just renting a room because it's a way of cutting the costs of what it would be to be a tenant in an apartment, is you can upgrade to actually controlling the house hack yourself. And so for me, after I had lived for a few years in this organizational unit that it was basically a rented room, I decided that I was going to rent a whole house and portion out the rooms in order to, first of all, control the rental environment. So that would mean that I would get to select the housemates myself and be able to choose who I was going to live with, and also put in place some of those house rules that were going to make my life better. But it also meant that financially there was going to be a positive return for me. And if you're able to set up your house hack in an intelligent way, it can actually lower your cost below what it would cost you to rent a room. So let me just give you an example. So let's say you were to decide, I want to set up this house hack, as a student or as somebody who's starting out, in their professional journey or wherever you are. Maybe you have bad credit and it's difficult to get the bank to lend you money to purchase something. If you consider renting a house, so let's say you would go and rent a 5-bedroom house for whatever price that would be, you would then work out what would be of value to the potential roommates that are coming in. And this really means that you got to think about who is your tenant population and what are their needs. When I was at this phase, I was a grad student and I was living in Vancouver. Vancouver was not as overpriced as it is today, but it was already significantly overpriced at that time. And I kind of thought about all the other students who are coming from out of town. And that was my situation. I relocated. I was living in Toronto before, and then I moved all the way across the country, to Vancouver, and I didn't know a single person. And so for me, like, it was disorienting to be in a new city and not know anybody there. But it also occurred to me that probably there's a whole bunch of other students or people who are relocating in my age bracket, or, the 10 years around my age bracket, who would be interested in sharing a house. And what would those people want? Well, probably they would want basic furnishings, and then they would want to have some kind of a dynamic in the house that they felt like they could, get into. And so that's exactly what I did. I rented a big house and then advertised the room on the platforms that at that time was where you could rent those rooms. And I just tried to make it as attractive as possible for those prospective people who are coming in. And if you're considering setting up a house hack, I would recommend putting some thought into the specific market that you live in and what kind of people you think your house hack could appeal to. And then this also has to do with the kind of lifestyle that you want to live. So for me, most of my house hacking days were done when I was a student, and then afterwards when I was just starting out my business. And so I was happy to be surrounded by other people who had that similar lifestyle, and so we were like kind of partying. I always wanted to have a relatively clean house, but that was kind of the vibe that we had going on. And so it meant that when people came in, it was relatively easy to integrate them into that environment. Now, I've heard other people do house hacks, for example, with travel nurses, or if you're working kind of more in like a labor market where there's people who are coming in because they need to just go to work, or they're doing shift work. That's going to create a different kind of vibe around the house hack. But basically, you want to set up the house as an environment for that's going to attract a specific kind of people. And the more similarity there is between those kind of people who come into the house hack, the easier it's going to be to get that to work as a nice thing. Then there's also, how do you convince the landlord? So, I remember when I first rented this house, I think I was 25 when I set up my first house hack like that. But, I went to see the landlord and I looked young. I must have looked like, 20. And the landlord really didn't think I could hack it. So it took some pretty good explaining to convince that person that they should allow me to rent the house. At that point, my parents got my parents to co-sign the lease. So that obviously added some additional, backup to what I was doing. But it was really a question of explaining to that person what my vision was for the house and being upfront about what I was doing. Because this is another thing. If you're looking at creating a house in a rented house, you want to make sure that, your landlord knows what you're going to do and is on board with it. Because if ever anything goes wrong, if ever they show up, if ever there's any maintenance that they need to do, it's going to be pretty bad for you if they discover that you've been setting up something untoward and that you are potentially making a bit of money by renting out the other rooms. So you definitely want to be transparent with your landlord if you're doing this in a rented situation. And anecdotally, this is like super funny because once I started becoming an investor, and I must have been, I don't know, 30, 35 at the time, another teenager, 19 years old, approached me to rent a unit to do exactly what I did when I was at that age. And it was just such a funny, full revolution of the circle to see someone coming to me and having that conversation with me and saying, look, I want to take on the master lease of this apartment because I want to cut my housing costs and I want to really control who I'm living with. Are you okay, Terry, with signing this master lease with me? And then I'm going to rent out the other rooms. And, at that point, her parents or her father co-signed the lease with her. So that made me feel, financially a little bit more secure. But it was also the type of conversation that I was able to have with that person. So if you want to flip this around and think about it from the landlord's perspective, if I have someone approach me to rent a bigger unit and tell me that they're going to want to do a house hack in there, if I feel like I can trust the person and they're well set up for it, it's definitely something that I'm going to be open to. So, I would encourage you, if you're thinking of doing this, be transparent with the owner and just come in and give them an unbeatable pitch as to your level of responsibility, the way in which you're going to run things, and the fact that their rent is always going to be paid and that there's going to be no degrading of the property. So before I move on to the next topic, one more thing. In order to protect yourself properly when you're doing this as a renter, you want to make sure that you are mitigating the risks when you go about renting those rooms. And this is where you want to do the same kind of due diligence that you would use when you're renting an apartment. And so it's not because you're renting a room and you think, the cost is lower, or maybe if I'm also living in the house hack because I'm the one who's setting it up, you think, well, if something goes wrong, like I'm going to be able to nip it in the bud. Don't make that decision and skip over doing your due diligence. So if you're going to set up a house hack, what kind of due diligence do you want to do, and how do you want to frame that bar for the people who are coming in? Well, I would recommend to run a tenant application the same way you would run as if you were renting out an apartment. And so if this means working with some kind of a third party service, I know that, in a lot of markets, there are third party services that you can even get the applicant to pay for. So I think there's one called Tenant Back Check, which serves all of North America. You can just find this on Google. It's super easy. But I would recommend that you run the same kind of background checks on your potential housemates that you would when you're renting out an apartment. If you're not sure what that is, just go and Google some of those tenant background check third party services. You don't need to have a real estate license. You don't need to be able to run credit checks yourself. Basically, like, those third party services just take care of everything for you. And then the next thing, you definitely need to have a contract. You need to also understand the legal environment in which you're operating and to understand what kind of contract are you allowed to have. I know that the market that I operate in, if you are the one who has kind of the master lease and you're busy, like, renting out the rooms, you actually are not allowed to sign a sublease, an official sublease with those tenants who are coming in. But that doesn't mean you can't just come up with your own one-page contract that just details the responsibilities that people have when they come in, and that sort of commits them to do certain things. So for example, if they want to move out, how long ahead do they have to tell you? With a room, I would recommend making that at least 30 days, because that's going to allow you to turn around and interview potential new housemates. You might also want to put some house rules in there, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. And then maybe also collect a damage deposit. And, at the beginning of my house hacking career, this was something that I would often waive because, I was young, I was inexperienced, and I felt bad at a time when I was renting to people who maybe didn't have that much disposable income. I felt bad taking that damage deposit. But over time, I found that it was just so important, because sometimes, in that kind of environment, if something goes wrong, the person can just take off in the middle of the night. It's not like when they sign a proper lease for a rental unit where you can enforce that through the rental board. Very often these are kind of more informal arrangements. And so, when you have someone who leaves, it's possible that they're going to leave you with some unpaid utilities bills. Like, maybe as part of the contract, you agree that you're going to share the utility bill in a certain way, or share the internet, or that there's going to be some incidental cost. And you, as the one who's setting up the house, chances are you're going to end up footing some of that, or maybe some of those contracts are going to be in your name. And so in addition to just covering the lost rent, you want to make sure that you have that damage deposit just to cover some of those incidental fees should ever the person decide to leave, or something untoward happens in a short time span. You at least want to make sure that you have a damage deposit to cover some of that. The next kind of level up of the house hack is when you intentionally purchase a property with the goal of setting up a house hack in there. And, for me, as I went through the various different levels of house hacking, I started moving into a house hack, so renting a room. Then I rented a place to set up my own house hack. And then step number 3 on that journey was to actually buy a building myself, and then create that house hacked environment from there in order to pay my mortgage, reduce my overhead, and kind of plan things out. So there are a bunch of different ways. When people say house hacking, like, usually, the first thing that comes to mind is you've bought like a 3-bedroom house or a 4-bedroom house, and you're renting out those rooms to other long-term tenants who are kind of end up becoming your roommates. So I think that's probably the most common model, but I just want to get into some of the ways that you can set this up, which allow those people either more or less into your space and more or less into your life. So one model that I've seen, which is not exactly that roommate model, is people choose to Airbnb or to short-term rent one room in their property. And to make this, I'll give you 2 examples of how I've seen this work. When I closed on my current single family home, we had this, additional bedroom in the basement with a bathroom right next to it that was kind of crying out to be an additional suite. Now, there was not a separate entrance for that suite, so the person ended up having to sort of come in through our garage, but we ran an Airbnb in there successfully for about a year before, our family moved on to do something else. But that was a way, and like in the Airbnb, basically, like, we set up like a little microwave, and there was a kind of a kettle and toaster down there, but it was clear that the person was not to come up and use our our common space was not to come and chill on our sofas or like, eat dinner with our family. So if you have, kind of some spare basement space or some space that's a little bit, it's still part of your main unit, but it's a little bit off, you can kind of set that up with rules however you want it to. And then in most places, if you're using Airbnb, you actually don't have to go through this complicated qualification process of, getting a permit and doing all this other kind of stuff. If you're doing it within your own rental unit, often the legal framework of that or the permits that you require for it are less complicated than if you're starting an Airbnb in a separate unit. Now, the other thing, which is, I guess, almost like, choosing to own a duplex. Like, and this is it's not really exactly a house hack, because for me, house hacking is when the people who come into the house are actually sharing the main unit and living together in some kind of a communal arrangement. If you were to purchase a duplex and rent out the other unit, that would be, I guess, a kind of a house hack. Another thing that I've seen people do is to create those basement units and then rent them with kind of a short-term rental. But that's more, we're getting kind of more into multifamily, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. The other thing that it is just very, very important to make sure that you understand before you get into some of these house hacking, before you start your house hacking journey, is just the legal environment around it. And it happens to me so often in my home market where, I have people who have been doing this informally and they're like, yeah, I have this 4-bedroom apartment and I just moved 4 people in there and signed an individual rental lease with each of them. And then, that's when I have a heart attack, or at least I have a heart attack for those people who are telling me this, because that's actually a huge legal problem. And I'll explain to you why. So basically in Montreal, the rule is that if you want to lease an actual room, the property has to be zoned as a rooming house. And in order to get a property zoned as a rooming house at the city, there are all kinds of rules that you have to abide by. So you need fire resistance within the walls. So every room has to have specific fire resistance in the walls. You need fire resistant doors. You need every hallway to be closed by a fire resistant doors. You need specific exit signs. Like, there are all sorts of things that you have to do in terms of modifying your property for it to be according to code for a rooming house. And very often people go and sign those leases with individual rooming tenants without having the permits. And this can be a huge problem on multiple fronts. So first of all, your insurance. If something goes wrong and your insurance finds out that you're running basically an illegal rooming house and the building burns down, they're not going to pay out. So that's like, make sure that whatever situation you're creating, your property is zoned for that. Then the other thing is with rental laws, because if you have somebody who's in one of those rooms and is not paying you, how are you going to enforce that contract when it's not a contract that you can legitimately sign for that kind of rental? So you really need to make sure that the contract that you're signing with people is actually the appropriate one for what you're trying to do, and don't kind of guess about this. You actually really need to understand the legal environment, the legal framework, which makes it okay to do what you do. Now, for those of you who are, in Montreal and want to understand how this has to work here, I'll tell you, it's you have to sign a master lease. So if you have 3 people who come to you as a disparate group of people and want to rent an apartment, you need to place them under one master lease. All 3 names need to be on the lease, and you're basically creating a contractual relationship between those 3 people and yourself. Now, it's possible in a residential lease like that to identify that everyone is responsible for a certain portion of the lease, and that makes them kind of independent entities, in that if one person doesn't pay, you're not going to go after the other person for the rent that they owe. But in terms of legally how you set up that house hacked situation in our local environment, in order to be okay with the city, in order to be okay with your insurance, and in order to be okay with the rental board, you need to create one master lease that everyone else is falling under, and not just rent out individual rooms, because you're actually putting yourself into an illegal situation. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the different things that you need to worry about from a legal standpoint and the different models of house hacking. So we have, if you're trying to just reduce your costs to save down payment money and be more financially appealing to the bank, you can consider renting a room. The step up from that is creating that rented house hack yourself by signing on the property and then portioning out the rooms yourself. And then the final level is, once you close on a property yourself and own it, you can also use house hacking as a rental model for that. And if you're planning on living in the property, this is another way of reducing your overhead. It can also be a rental model that might allow you to collect additional rent, because if you were to rent a unit just as, one unfurnished unit versus renting 3 rooms and then furnishing those rooms, you might be able to command, and this might be kind of an upsell, a way to make more money with the same unit. And so just to, optimize the rental value of those units. So that's kind of the business model side of it. But now I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that you can do to make your house run more smoothly. And it's living with roommates, having people share communal space it's a kind of a personal thing. And in order for that arrangement to work well, there are some things that are just going to take a whole lot of fight out of it. And through my years of house hacking, one of the things that I found super important was to just write the absolute clearest ad possible. And my ad went something like this. So I had a dog. So, I would introduce myself and say, "Hi, I'm Terry. I'm this age. I'm a student. This is what I do. I have a dog, and I'm an extremely clean person. I'm, fairly relaxed about noise and what time people are going to be awake, but I do have a day job. And so I expect there to be quiet hours during the night. And I want my unit to be very clean. If this doesn't work for you, please don't come here. Please don't respond to this ad, because we're just going to end up fighting with each other and it's not going to be nice for anyone." So with that ad, already the type of people who were responding to me were the kind of people who fit that description. And then when I would have them come and visit the house, I would really underline that again, just in case somebody made it there and didn't read the fine print of the ad. I would just be like, "Okay, come in and visit my location and have a walk around. Look at the kitchen, look at the bathroom. This is the standard to which I keep my place. And if you don't see yourself fitting with that, if you're someone who's not comfortable with this level of cleanliness, please do us both a favor and just tell me now, and no hard feelings, but let's not have a situation created where we're both uncomfortable in our own home environment because we have different levels of cleanliness." So whatever, like, I would encourage you to just put down on paper, if you're new to this, what are some of those things that are super important for you? Is it cleanliness? Is it quiet hours? Are people allowed to have visitors? Is it something to do with house pets? It actually happened that because I had a dog and was open to having another dog in the house, I ended up having a bunch of roommates who came in with a second dog. And so for me, that was kind of like a sales angle. But for example, I don't like cats. And so it would have been, I had people come and respond to the ad who were like, "I have my declawed cat who's 10 years old. She's not going to be a problem." And I'm like, "No, that's kind of not going to work for my house because I don't really want to live with a cat." So you need to just be really intentional and upfront about the kind of things that are going to bother you, and then set that up in the ad and underline it again in that interview when those people come to visit, just to make sure that you're going to be selecting away from somebody who might create conflict. And this has always worked really well. I lived with many roommates for a 10-year period, and I actually never had any stress around these kind of issues because I was just so upfront and clear about it from the very beginning. The next thing you can do, just if you want to really double check that after you've done all your due diligence, so you've done your tenant background check the way you normally would, is make sure you spend some time on the phone with their references. So where was this person living before? If you can talk to their housemates. I mean, sometimes I would have people move out of their parents' house, and I was not embarrassed to call up mom and be like, "Okay, so and so is looking at coming into my house hack. What should I know about them that's going to make both of us happy? What's going to save us both time?" So, in the same way as if you were hiring someone, you would call their references, speak to the last people who they were living with, even if it's an ex-boyfriend or if it's family members. Just take the time to have that really chill conversation. And the more chill and upfront you are, the more likely you are that those people are going to take the time to give you a proper answer. And then the last aspect is just house rules. And we used to have those taped on the fridge in the house. So just in case, somebody might not have exactly we went through the interview process and it sounded like we were on the same page, I would just have a list of house rules in terms of, when you're done with the dishes, please wash them within, 1 hour of cooking. Or if you want to have somebody over, please take the time to text the other housemates just to make sure that it's okay. Or however you want to set up those house rules in such a way that there's going to be boundaries established and that it's clear to everyone what the expectations are. And if you can put those rules in a place that are visible, bathroom mirror, back of the bathroom door, on the fridge, on one of the kitchen cabinets, like wherever it is that that paper is, in your face and clear, it's just going to save you conflict and make it very clear from the beginning what is that sort of contract between you guys. Even if it's not, a legally binding contract, it's going to be clear to everyone what the expectations are as far as sharing common space and being in each other's space. Because, house hacking, it's just that one level of more personal in terms of having people in your personal space. And, by way of conclusion, I think this is kind of where I want to end this episode, which is house hacking, because it's sharing your own personal space. This is not a solution that's for everyone. However, I think that depending on where you are in your journey, especially if you're maybe younger or you're more at the beginning of your journey, to consider being very smart about how you cut your housing expenses as a renter or as a young investor who's who's living perhaps in an expensive market where it's difficult to bite off that huge chunk of a single family home initially. If you put some thought into this model, it can really be a great way to help you get onto that first rung of the property ladder, or to climb it little by little, in the way I did at the beginning of my career, first as a room renter, then as a house hacker, then as someone who, it was my investment business model. And then finally, when I did close on my single family home, for the first year that I owned it, the mortgage was a big chunk for me. And my way of offsetting that was to do that Airbnb in my basement at the time. But that allowed me to finally now acquire the property that my family is very happy in, just because I was able to take that incremental step that financially did not sink my battleship. It did not put me into a difficult position, because I was making sure that I was making conservative financial decisions and not putting myself in a situation where I was going to be stressed with this tool of house hacking. So hopefully, I've laid some of that out for you and opened some thoughts to this that are going to allow you, if you're struggling with making those initial moves, that are going to help you save some of that money, either to invest in a down payment right away, to scale what you're doing, or else to pay for some real estate education that's going to just help you progress as an investor.